Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Comprehensive nonsense.
Hi everyone. So today's episode of the podcast is all about science, and this is a topic that we've been discussing amongst ourselves for the past few months, and largely around the work of Charles Eisenstein, who wrote this book and others. It's called The Ascent of Humanity, and there's a large section in it which is all to do about science, its method, its assumptions, and in his work largely questioning why it's become sort of the dominant, he would call, mythology of our time, and the potential problems that come with this. And so we're going to start this podcast with Rob talking about what he understands science to be, its method and its assumptions, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, as someone who is, I guess I'm probably allowed to call myself a scientist at this point. I have a pretty, or at least I thought before reading this, before this summer really, I thought I had a pretty set opinion of what science was. And I realized I didn't, upon these discussions, I realized I didn't really, I hadn't really questioned it all. So after a bit of time, I now think I have a pretty clear kind of picture in my head for what I think science is. And the best way I think I can explain understanding this is to try and understand sort of what science was invented for, like what its purpose was. And if you look at kind of the history of it, you've got people like Galileo, Newton, Copernicus, who in the kind of what's called the scientific revolution, kind of had they kind of came from a world where this didn't exist, to basically trying to work out a rational way of working out how the world works. And the key things to realize here is that it's a group of individual thinking kind of consciousnesses trying to work out how the world in which they share works. So there's already a whole host of assumptions that have been put into that, which we'll get to, but I'm just going to leave you that kind of initial kind of background to kind of think on. So we're talking about something that uses rational logic, because that was quite big. The Enlightenment kind of this was quite a big topic at the time of the scientific revolution. So it's using logic rather than any faith where it can. It's using kind of deductive reasoning where it can. So that's kind of the first thing that we have to realize. And it has to assume that this is valid. So that's your first assumption, that rational thought is valid. The second kind of major assumption, probably the first, actually. The first major assumption it has to assume is that there is an objective truth out there. That there is, to start any kind of logical framework, the first thing you have to say is true. And then from that, you can build kind of what is true, what isn't true. But if you don't have truth, then there's nothing. And the counterpoint to that, there are some, I don't know if there are some people, but it's certainly a philosophical standpoint, which is kind of a pure form of nihilism, which is to believe that there is nothing. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, though science assumes truth, every other belief system you've heard of aside from nihilism also believes that there is objective truth. They might believe there's more than one, but they do believe that that does exist. The second thing that it then assumes is that there is existence. So we've assumed we've assumed that truth, we've assumed truth, and now we're assuming that that things exist. And then the third thing it assumes is that time is one of those things that exists. That is, that there is a past, and the past is set as we know it. There is a present, and that is what is happening right now. And there is a future, and that is what is, as far as we can tell, yet to pass. And the future is uncertain, the past is certain, and the present is kind of the transition state between the two. And the key other assumption we're assuming along with time is that we are all traveling through time in the same direction. That's kind of the arrows of time assumption, is that we aren't, if you want to go look these things up, there are things like block time and other kind of possible comprehensions of time where people are kind of moving, well, not even people, but individuals move through time in like a 4-dimensional space, and we're all moving through it in the same way we move through kind of 3D space, not in the same direction, whereas science sort of assumes that we all move through it in one direction. The next thing it assumes is that there is a material world. Not that the whole world necessarily is material, but there is a material world, and that within that we share, or to some degree, the individuals in question share said material world. So that's another assumption, is that there is some sort of interface, and that we share. So part of my reality is also your reality. And part of your reality is my reality, basically, which is a key assumption because there's multiple, the whole point of this, if we remember back to the beginning, there's multiple individuals and they're trying to understand their shared world. So that's sort of the purpose of it. So it's limited by its purpose. And then they assume that there is at least some causality. There's some reason for something happening, right? If I lift up this mouse and drop it, that there is, a reason for, one, that mouse not kind of, the matter not randomly blasting all over the place. There's a reason the mouse always is falling down, not up. And there's a reason, there might be some randomness in the universe, sure, or the material world, but there is also some causality. And the reason that's important is for rational deduction to occur, you need to have a why. If you don't have a why, if something's totally random, you can't rationally deduce anything. So it's also limited, therefore, to only ever understanding that elements of our shared material world that are causal, that has a cause and effect, that have a reason for occurring, that isn't random. And then it assumes, and this is potentially an assumption I don't understand so much, but it's one that I've seen in the kind of research I've done uniformly, and that is that there's sort of inseparability. Time is linked to the material world and is effectively the change in the material world. So, if everything in the material world, all the atoms were to become 0 Kelvin, absolute zero, have no energy, there was no change, time would stop. And what it's saying there is, those two are linked. And then the last two things I sort of want to say, as I understand as the kind of assumptions of science, are that it doesn't disregard inherently the existence of an immaterial world or parts of our realities that are not shared. It simply cannot, it doesn't concern itself with those parts of our realities, because that's not its objective. Its objective is to find out a kind of as complete a picture as we can of that reality that we share. That's its only kind of interest, if you will, of the scientific method. So things like, if there was something that was true for me in a part of my reality that wasn't part of anyone else's, science is not that it doesn't say that isn't real, it just frankly is not interested in discovering that. And the last thing that science, I think, assumes, or the last two things, but kind of the two things I think make science unique as a belief system, because the other thing I want to say is pretty much all other belief systems I can think of assume all of the things I've said above, apart from perhaps Buddhism, which doesn't assume that there is any material world at all that we share. But the plenty of other belief systems, I think, do assume all the things I've said. But science will make is that you have a kind of, it accepts it can never know an objective truth, but that it assumes it can get closer. So if I, pick up this mouse, that's twice now that mouse has fallen. So I'm gathering evidence. And now that evidence is never, because we're not outside our own system, we can never truly understand an absolute truth about the why that mouse has fallen. We can, I can test it again, and I'm not going to keep testing it, but I could. And you can see where this is going. We can get more and more sure of the fact that mouse will fall. And then you can investigate that, and you can start to understand that, and you can get basically to what we call beyond reasonable doubt of a reason why something occurs. So that's 99.9999 etc% sure that something is true, and we can never truly know it, but we can know it much more than anything else, any other method can know it. So that's the one thing that it is unique. And the second thing is that once you know something, or don't know something, but you're 99.99 etc% sure, you can then use that as a base assumption for further experiments, with the knowledge that doing those further experiments is testing that base assumption as well, and therefore not kind of compounding the uncertainty. So yeah, that's my understanding, I think, of science. Briefly, I realize I've taken up quite a bit of time, so I'm going to let the others dig into that, and then kind of, if there's anything I've missed, I'm sure they'll ask me quite good questions about it. So, far away, guys.
Okay, so I mean, before we maybe dig into a few of them and kind of question those as assumptions, I want to ask you, do you think that these assumptions have stayed the same throughout the history of science?
I think perhaps some have been added. For example, the inseparability one. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's been proven yet, but I think has now been assumed. And I think perhaps the arrows of time one, so the one where all of us are moving, time, just moves forward, and we all move through it in the same direction. I think perhaps that is that's been added. I don't actually know. I don't know the full. Well, I didn't take the history and philosophy of science course that was available to both of us. Me and Sil, by the way. But we could get someone on if the future thought of someone who.
I think my mum took it. but might be
Wasn't
better.
hand took it, so we could get on. But yeah, I don't know the ins and outs and the exact dates, but it wouldn't surprise me if some were added, and it wouldn't surprise me. Actually, it probably the ones I just mentioned. I don't think any will have been modified or taken away. I would have thought.
I must say,
at its very core form.
I must say, just for the bat, though, I think assumptions have changed massively because you mentioned Copernicus, for example. We used to assume the Earth was the center of the universe, and all our calculations are based on that. And I don't know, I think assumptions have changed.
Yeah, but would you call that like a base philosophical assumption?
Yeah.
That's the thing is, I get loads of our assumptions of how the world works, kind of given the stuff I've just said, have changed. But the stuff I've just said, I don't think has. It's kind of, obviously there are kind of plenty of moments in science where we've gone, oh, wait, there's this thing called evolution, or, oh, wait, there are the laws of physics. And, oh, wait, no, there's actually not the laws of physics and there's relativity and they were all wrong. And there are plenty of stuff like that about kind of the way said material world works that we've got wrong, or not got wrong, but kind of realized we were assuming too much about the physical world. But I think those kind of very base philosophical assumptions I just mentioned about kind of that there is a physical world, that we share it, like those are the very core things that you kind of very first have to build from.
Yeah, no, I got it.
I think you're right in that science, I think, did come from a place of very kind of pure intention of trying to find a sort of truth that can be a consensus across everyone, regardless of where they've come from, or trying to find this objective reality as a basis to agree on things, I think. However, I'm not sure that actually these assumptions were, apart from that kind of assumption, potentially, would you call that an assumption? But I'm not sure that a lot of these things were there at the start or haven't evolved and changed with the culture of the time from the start. So we're back after a short break. And continuing with that line of thought, Rob, I wanted to ask you what your main issues were with Charles Eisenstein's work.
Right, so I wrote this down, it annoyed me so much.
How much, Rob?
How much did it annoy me, or how much did I write down?
Both.
Both. How much did it annoy you, though?
I wrote about a page down that annoyed me. And it annoyed me enough that I vented a lot to multiple people. My dad,
Really?
Oscar,
Mikey, I imagine.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, vent to us now.
Vented to Mikey. And I guess a bit to Zoe as well. We had a little phone call at one point.
Yeah. It's quite funny for me because I feel like you vented to Mikey before you vented to me. And so when Mikey vents to me, I just get secondhand Rob.
Nice. So in the Way of the World section, where there's a chapter called The Scientific Method, Kimi disagreeing with it. And there's one particular paragraph where he goes, here is I'm just going to read it out. Here is a central assumption of the scientific method that may seem so obvious as to be beyond dispute. If two people perform an identical experiment, they will get the same results. I had an issue with that, sort of don't really have an issue with that anymore, because he sort of self-corrects himself in that he's saying, if you're performing an identical experiment, well, obviously the results are going to be the same if you've already stated that the experiment is identical. So that's kind of correct, but a bit of a nothing statement. And then he goes, this requires, 1, determinism, that the same initial conditions will result in the same final conditions. Well, I completely disagree with that, because that's leap in faith, right? He's not said that two people perform the identical initial conditions, then they will get the same results. He said if two people perform an identical experiment, i.e. from start to finish, they will get the same results. And I don't think that science does assume that that the same initial conditions will result in the same final conditions. That's sort of why we repeat everything. And that's also, if we did assume that, how else would we have, come to the conclusion, or how else could you try to prove that, radioactive decay is random and doesn't obey rules of causality?
No, but wait. So just going back, I think surely that's what logic is. If A plus B equals C, then those in the same initial conditions will always equal C, right?
Yeah, but only if the system is totally causal, and we're only assuming partial.
I thought causality wasn't a central assumption. You said.
Yeah, partial causality. Yeah, not everything is causal, because if you assume everything is causal, that would be determinism.
So I think you hit on a point which separates how science has evolved through the years, where I think a lot of the time causality was a central assumption, compared to how science is evolving now with the introduction of a lot of new things which invalidate old ideas. And also, what was the second thing? The distinction between how science is maybe in its purest intention form and by scientists understood in the way that I think you understand it.
Yeah.
In that it doesn't say this is the absolute truth.
Science is a method versus science as a body.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
no, I completely get how science as a body is fallible and is human and is way more kind of open to changing politics and time and causing much more harm than perhaps I think the method is capable of.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I left it there.
No, that's fine. But I think that kind of science, like science as a body, and also what Eisenstein would call the sort of Newtonian Cartesian ideas of science, before I guess you bring in things like quantum theory and other very new ways of thinking, is what he's talking about. But he's talking about those because because science and logic has worked so well hand in hand with technology to enable human control over the natural world, it has become the dominant worldview.
I also think it's sort of so another issue I had with Eisenstein is, and this will try and take me, I'm going to try and do this in concise a way as I can, but this might take me a little while.
That's okay.
Is he he doesn't really dismantle it for me, but I guess the way I read his book is he sort of goes about in a relatively intelligent way dismantling the mythology that our current world predicates on.
Mm-hmm.
And then tries to sort of say, well, there's this other one or other ones, and we need to kind of lean more into and learn more from those.
Mm-hmm.
Form a new one. But the thing that I find so compelling about science is that although it doesn't focus at all on all the individual truths, and it can't focus on this is the method I'm talking about rather than the body, it can't focus on individual truths, personal truths. It can only focus on group things that are true for us rather than things that are true for me. That means when society has to make decisions and is making decisions, when groups of people have to make decisions, they can only really make decisions, especially on a large scale, based on what is true for, or what is, understood to be true. Obviously, it's not an absolute truth, as we've said, but based on what is most likely to be true for the group. And science provides, where it can, ideas, kind of theories that are most true for the whole rather than just individuals. And so it allows you to make perhaps more informed decisions kind of by necessity as a society than other methods of thinking do.
See, I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think one of the problems with science is that it's one way of thinking about the world and understanding the world, yet it thinks that it can encompass the whole of reality into that one way of thinking about the world.
That I really disagree with.
Why?
I think there are plenty of scientists who do think that. And that's what I have an issue with when I say the body of science. I mean, like, the kind of academic community of scientists. I think there are plenty among those who believe, among the academic community, who believe that science can and will one day, and I say believe, not think, because I think it can and will one day explain everything, but I don't believe it necessarily. Whereas I think it has got to the point now where plenty of scientists don't leave enough doubt in their mind as to whether science can discover everything or not, and just believe that it will one day discover a theory of everything, a unified field theory, whatever you want to call it. And obviously, if it ever did do that, and it was able to prove that everything we knew had kind of causal roots, and that the only non-causal roots we were able to identify where those were random, then it would be able to prove that, our material world isn't affected by anything else, and therefore is the whole of reality. But it hasn't.
I thought the whole point was it can't.
And
you believe it can't?
No, I don't believe it can't.
You believe there could be a unified field theory?
Yeah. I believe it. No, so yeah, I believe there could be. Basically, I think there probably will be at some point a unified field theory. But I don't intrinsically believe that, because it's not been shown to be beyond reasonable doubt yet. I think it would be naive to believe it yet.
At that point, right, if you're believing that there could be a unified field theory, you have to, if you're striving for that, surely that is then the objective truth. There is an objective truth for everyone, right? Because if the unified field theory exists, and that means that the same laws apply to every single person in this entire universe, right?
I think it's something slightly different. I think it's
no. So like, there's a big difference here between believe and think.
Okay, but as in,
I don't believe that I believe there could be a unified field theory, and I think that that's probably true. And I think, yes, we probably do all have one objective truth for everyone.
Okay.
But I don't believe that there is one objective truth for everyone, because unified field theory hasn't been proven beyond reasonable doubt yet. I think many scientists, before it's been proven beyond reasonable doubt, do believe it. Think and believe scientists believe that a unified field theory. And think is what an individual supposes to be the most probable outcome. Believe is what an individual, understands the world to be. You just sent these screenshots. I'm now trying to find them.
I think as well, though, when going back a bit,
yeah,
I don't think there's a difference between what the body of, like, I think it. Oh wait, what am I trying to say? I think it's like what the body of science believes, and connecting to how a society should make decisions. even the idea that science is the best way of making decisions about the world, I think is maybe not necessarily true. And the idea that science can be this thing that is better than all the other religions or all the other ways of looking at the world, and is better in that way, and therefore can make decisions from that, I think is arrogant, and it dismisses other ways of understanding the world. It dismisses the validity of that.
So just to clarify a few things in my head there.
Yeah.
When you say understand the world, do you mean like the whole world or just the world in which we share? Because I would say science is probably, I wouldn't call it arrogant because I agree with it, but I think science would be validly saying that it agrees with, that it can explain the world which we share better than anything else. But I would also say that, say there is, and science hasn't disproven this yet, so I'm definitely not discarding it. Say there is some kind of spiritual world out there. It's not something I've experienced, but I'm fully aware I've met loads of people who firmly believe it to be something that you can experience, and I'm definitely not discrediting that. Science would never is on the complete polar opposite end of the scale, in that it doesn't even try to explain that. It doesn't dismiss it. It just accepts it is never going to be able to use logic to explain that.
Yet, okay, so I think,
and so that's not invalid, but I think that's also, it's individual. That's something that's vital for individuals making decisions, but it's virtually irrelevant for groups making decisions. I don't see how you could convince me to believe something given a spiritual experience only you have had.
Okay, so I think you've hit on another point, which started back at the beginnings of science, when I believe it was Galileo or people of his era, because they were trying to find this way of explaining the world which is separate to like religion and spirituality. There was the truth. So they basically separated the world into the material and the spiritual. And the spiritual realm was the realm of kind of everything that couldn't be explained by science, and like consciousness and secondary qualities, I guess, would go into that. And they just kind of like, they separated it, put it aside and said, we don't explain that. As science, we explain the material. And from what I've heard and read people talking about it, is that this initial separation, they were still very much aware of this other world, yet they kept to their material side. However, I think as science grew through the ages, it discarded this spiritual aspect. And even what you said just now, how that, I mean, just the idea that this other world, I mean, this dualism is just one way of thinking about it. But even the idea that nothing other than the material bears an impact on how we make decisions and why we should make decisions.
So the common, I mean, I sort of, the end of that, if I'm honest, sort of, I slightly missed the last sort of sentence, because Zoe sent me something from a relevant thing to the pod from the screenshot of her and Mikey having conversations. We'll probably get, for those of you who are wondering who this Mikey boy is, we keep mentioning, he will probably be on in an episode or two to contribute to this discussion. He's a computer science friend we have, who has been involved in these before. But from what the kind of the 90% of the beginning that I did hit, the common kind of arguments when it comes to material and immaterial world that I understand are that if something can interact with the material world in any repeatable manner, or any manner that is, has a reason, well, not or, both, then it is actually not immaterial. It is part of the material world, because then you can kind of basically you can perform experiments on anything that can be tested multiple times and has a reason for occurring. So if there's a sort of spiritual experience that occurs multiple times and has a non-random reason for occurring, then that can be tested and understood as part of the material world. If it is affecting the material world in a random way, or in a way that has that only occurs once and is, you know, a one-off and has no repeatability, then it's still interacting with the material world and is therefore still part of the material world. So for something to be truly immaterial, in my mind, it would have to be something that is kind of untangibly, but somehow, you know, yeah, immaterially associated. You know, there's no actual connection between it and the material world, but there still is. It has to be by definition illogical, or something that, you know, is affected. The only other way it could exist is if it's something that kind of is affected by the material world but doesn't affect the material world itself. I've probably not made any sense in what I just said. That was pretty non-comprehensible nonsense.
No, I think it does, but I think you've basically said why dualism is unsatisfactory, which, I mean, there are many reasons why it is unsatisfactory.
Give me, and maybe the others, give me an explanation of dualism, unless that was what we've basically just explained there.
Yeah, that's like dualism is.
There are two separate worlds, but they interact, but they don't.
Yeah. Oh, here we go.
Just what we need you for. Amazing.
Yeah. So actually, I think from what I've read, there are different. Well, I'll read out this first, which is Zoe's brought up the definition of dualism. In the philosophy of mind, dualism is a theory that the mental and the physical, or mind and body, or mind and brain, are in some sense radically different kinds of thing. So initially, this was the separation of everything kind of spiritual consciousness thing. Well, actually, it was a separation of everything that you could basically measure and everything that you couldn't. Stemming from like a reductionist way of thinking that was part of a lot of kind of early science. So if you reduce something down to its component parts and you find out what those parts are, you will explain how a thing works and explain a thing. However, if you take something like color, for example, you would have, so the reductionist way of explaining color would be you've got the light which bounces off the object, and then that comes at a certain frequency and it's interacting with the I'm going to get this wrong, but the neurons in your eyes, and that goes to your brain and you see it as a color. However, the idea of like a color being like that is separate to like the kind of physical action of what's going on. And same example for like feelings. You can explain a feeling in terms of its kind of like its material parts, but the feeling is kind of something separate that science can't really or doesn't really concern itself with until you get into like later stages of science.
Yeah.
So dualism evolved into different things. I mean, I think dualism was what kind of started because you've got like separation of kind of religion and science, and science concerned itself with the material, and
yeah,
as that evolved,
the shared material, shall we say? I suppose that probably is. Yeah,
I don't think that was a necessary distinction in its conception. However, as it's evolved, you've got different frames of thinking. For example, you've got pure just materialism, which is materialism is the material is all that there is. And I don't really know how they explain things that aren't material, but that's what they say.
Well, okay, what for example isn't material?
Well, it's interesting. Would you say photons are material, Rob?
See, this is where me being an evolutionary biologist is really, really humbling. As I understood, the way you asked that as a chemist really, really intimidates me, because you probably have a far better understanding of photons than I do. But as I understood, yes, I would say they are material.
Yeah.
Explain to me how I'm wrong.
Well, I think they would be understood as material in the scientific world because they can be observed.
Yeah, so this is why I brought it up, because you said, what do you understand as material? But like, because they basically have zero mass. However, as you say, they can be observed and they are considered a fundamental particle. However, so does material world necessarily have to have mass? Or no.
Oh, no, it's okay, so what do I understand as the material world is anything that can, by any extended interaction, interact with matter. So matter and anything that affects matter, I would consider the material.
What do you consider matter then?
Oh God.
It's almost
Yeah.
See, I want to say, I as I understand it, anything made up of fundamental particles with mass. Anything with mass. Yeah.
Anything with mass.
Interesting.
Then
anything that interacts with that is still part of the material world.
So anything that interacts with things with mass.
Or and things with mass, but I mean they interact
because
intrinsically.
If it has to have mass, then that goes against Sill's definition of a photon.
Yeah, but a photon interacts with something that has mass, right? So therefore it would be material.
The definition of matter is the physical substance in general as distinct from mind and spirit, that which occupies space and possesses rest mass, especially as distinct from energy.
So would you say, but a photon is a quanta of energy, right?
Magnetic energy.
Yeah, so it isn't matter.
No, exactly.
It's a fundamental particle of energy, right?
Yes. However,
my physics is still not shit. Yes.
So in this definition, it wouldn't classify as matter, but we can observe it, and therefore it is part of the material world. Is what you're saying? Is what you?
But if it interacts with matter,
then
it's part of the material world. Is what I'd say. It doesn't have to be matter to be part of the material world. It just has to have an observable, by any deductible means, interaction with matter. Current science, and this is definitely something I think that has probably changed over the years. Almost certainly has changed over the years. I think we've already explained it. It's changed over the years. Current science's understanding of the spirit, or like immaterial things, that anything that doesn't, in any kind of measurable, observable, predictable way, interact with matter. If it does interact with matter, either we can't measure it, or it's totally non-causal. Basically, it doesn't have a logical reason why.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure about this interacting with matter side of it, because you could kind of say anything interacts with matter.
That's sort of why I think materialists are materialist.
Aren't materialist.
Are materialist. Because I think if something they believe
matter, they believe it means it is matter, which is
no. They believe if something, they believe if it can't interact with matter, then it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
I've started to think. I was thinking about this recently, though. This is just a side tangent, which is probably not healthy at this point in the discussion, right? But say we have a material world, right? Just suppose that exists. Assume that. Bold decision. And that material world like happens, and it goes by, and it's this nice sort of self, only things, it's materialistic, as it were. Only things from that material world affect that material world. That doesn't mean that material world couldn't feasibly be observed externally.
Yeah.
And if it could be observed externally by something that cannot affect it, but could be then affected by it, you could have, this is why I fundamentally can't agree with, I can agree with materialism. I don't believe it, but I could think that materialism is right for kind of why our world works. But I could never believe materialism as a total explanation, because there could always be a material world that affects but is not affected by an immaterial world. Like if there's something that we are, if our actions have immaterial effects, but said immaterial effects never come back to affect us in any way, we can never know that because it's never affecting us.
But also, surely that's slightly contradictory. If you're saying there could be something out there, immaterial, which the material world could react with, but not
necessarily react with. I don't know how it would be observed. It would have to be a kind of, I don't know how the material world would be observed by the immaterial world.
Sure.
But I think that sort of by definition, we wouldn't know how that happens, right?
But you did say the material world could affect that observer, right?
Yeah, because I mean, if you see something, you might have opinions on it, and then that could, provided there's something that can have opinions in this immaterial world. But like, if the observer can observe it, then it can affect them.
Yeah, sure. But do you think it could? Do you think the material world could then not be affected by the observer? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I think that is possible. You could have a one-way conduit of effect.
You think that is possible?
Well, the whole point is it's something we'll never be able to know, right? It's a purely metaphysical question. It's not a question that is, you can't answer that, and therefore to believe it to be not true, I think is silly.
But I would think that given,
you can think what you want.
But also to believe it's true is silly, like as in to.
But given
that, either way. But the point is, I would then say you should assume the thing that is more likely to be, or you assume the thing that has moral consequences. I think
moral consequences.
Well, yeah, if you have a purely metaphysical question, this is how I operate in my mind anyway, and you can never more know the answer. Like, using science, you can never know the answer more. Or using your own spiritual experiences, you can never know the answer more. Then you just have to assume, well, like, for example, we have no evidence, and there is no way we can ever have evidence that there is objective truth, that there is existence. Both are total suppositions, right? But if we assume either of those is not true, then the world has no meaning. If we assume that it is true, the world might still have no meaning, but also might have meaning. And the risk, if we assume that it's not true and therefore go about our lives like there is no meaning, when there's a small chance there is meaning, is very dangerous, because then if there is meaning, you are missing that meaning, right? You are that's morally bad. Whereas if you take the odds that there is existence and there is truth, and you go through life assuming that there is meaning to it, and then it turns out that there is no meaning, you're in no worse a position than if there was no meaning to begin with. Whereas if there was meaning and you assumed there was meaning, at least you've got somewhere, right? So with these suppositions, I think you have to take the outcome that you have to assume the outcome that is, most kind of, or all of the outcomes that are morally relevant. And if you've got an immaterial world that supposedly can have moral consequence that, you know, could feasibly be affected by us, then you have to assume that, even though obviously, you know, any listeners will be going, well, obviously if you can't tell how it's being affected, how does that affect any of your, how does that affect you? Well, it doesn't. But I think it's worth even conceptually mentioning.
But for example, we could never prove or not prove that there is a God. So why are you not praying to God all the time?
Right, I don't think either of these even matter if we can prove it or not prove it, because I don't think that's how people make decisions. I don't think that's how people believe things and think things.
This is obviously how Rob is making and I'm questioning that.
No, but like even this idea that you can make a rational decision based on like a moral thing, they're all just cultural constructs.
No, they're not. Disagree.
Really?
Yeah. I don't think they're. I think the whole point of like ethics, right, is to have non-social morality or non-cultural morality. It is to have a rational kind of a rational morality that isn't influenced by the culture in which it's in. That's like the whole field of ethics. That's why it exists as a field of research. That's why you have people like, you know, in ethics who will go, fundamentally, there's nothing, like we should be supporting paedophiles.
No. Okay. Let me rephrase my question.
Just to any listeners of the pod,
while you rephrase,
we are not going to go into moralities of paedophilia.
No.
I'll just ask Rob the same, or like a question I want him to answer.
Okay.
Because I know you're an agnostic, right, Rob? Which means
decidedly so, yeah.
You cannot, as in you believe that we'll never know if there's a God or not. However, you just say you take the most moral decision and what could be the best outcome from you. So if you don't know if there's a God or not, and based on what you just said, why are you not praying to God every day?
Because if they're so, have you watched any or listened or read any Christopher Hitchens or Stephen Fry on this matter?
One of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Eisenstein.
Well, yeah, no, that video is interesting. No, the basically, I think if there is a God and it's, you know, there's a whole chance there could be a God. I think.
Yeah.
The odds in my mind that God is any of the monotheistic gods, please don't take offense here, Zoe, is akin to, I mean, if you take all of the atoms, fundamental particles in the universe, and then you square that number and put that number of zeros past the decimal point and then put 1, those are approximately your odds, I reckon. And that's probably quite generous. Of any of the individual, you know, I mean, it's a bit of humorous joke. I'll get to the answer to your question, still, of any of the monotheistic gods existing. But if that monotheistic God does exist, that individual God, because obviously there's an equal good chance that the Pastafarian God of there's a spaghetti monster flying in the sky exists, as there is a kind of the Lord Almighty kind of Christian God. You know, if I do choose to worry about the monotheistic ones, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, firstly, I think the God's pretty evil. I think he's done a whole host of bad things, and I'm not really predisposed to wanting to pray to him because, you know, I think his idea of morality is probably not a good one. Or his side of his morality is not a good one, is not the good one. But secondly, if I worried about praying to every single possible God, I simply wouldn't have enough time in my life to do that. So I have to assume, I have to treat life as if none of them exist and treat them all equally. Because the belief in, you know, Catholicism is equally strong or not strong, or, you know, number of atoms in the universe, number of fundamental particles in the universe squared not strong, as all of the other beliefs in gods, be it Hinduism, Pastafarianism, or the other ones that have never been invented, Judaism, etc. I can't pray to all those gods.
What was your question?
So although I think they're all equally, or not necessarily equally likely, I think the ones that have had a whole, history of people meddling with their holy books, probably less likely. But I think although they're all potentially true, I don't bother spending my time on any of the individual one, because that would be, I wouldn't have enough time in my life. And there's also very real moral assumptions to be dealing with otherwise. Does that answer your question, or is that really a load of long-winded nonsense? We're getting a lot of that, sorry.
I'd say one thing to that, in the same way that science is trying to find a shared, truth.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of an objective truth, like one way I often think about religions is seeing different aspects of a kind of shared truth or existence of being. And I mean, I don't know if that necessarily relates to like praying to God or whatever, but I just thought I'd say that. Anyway, reframing my question, it was more about
wait, sorry. Can I just interject quickly and answer? Sorry about that. So the thing I find, I would say with science, the reason I buy that over all the others, because you made a good point that they're all basically, why go with science when you've gone, as opposed to the others, is that, so what I was saying earlier about you have to make, or I feel like I have to make the assumptions that kind of assume a moral outcome, or assume an outcome that gives meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the base assumptions that give you meaning in this world happen to be those same base assumptions that science has, plus science also assumes there's multiple individuals. Buddhism doesn't. Buddhism just assumes the base assumptions for morality, right? That's what's interesting. That's why I think many scientists are Buddhists and vice versa, and why there's a lot of kind of coexistence of the two. But I think, you look at the assumptions you need to assume for any kind of meaning or morality to exist in the world, you need to assume objective truth. Not that you can ever find it, but you just need to assume that there is some sort of truth out there.
Mm.
Existence, because you need to assume that you exist, and some form of, I guess, causality, because to have a cohesive thought, you have to have causality. And then all the rest, all the other assumptions of science basically are there to provide a framework for multiple individuals existing in a shared world. So as you will, Buddhism follows all the base assumptions for individual morality, and science provides follows all the base assumptions for group morality. And that's why I choose to believe in science as a scientist, and why I am very badly and very weakly attempting to try and understand in the long term probably some Buddhism as well. But I keep getting told I'm wrong by Sil, so it doesn't really seem to be going very well.
Wrong about the Buddhism, or
yeah, well, we'll get to that. You might find that in about 4 years' time, but I'm nowhere close right now.
Right, I was going to reframe my question, and I'm not sure it really turns into a question anymore. But it's more thinking about the idea that science is kind of separate from subjectivity, and the idea that you can form your decisions based on logic and say, okay, so if this is or say you've got two possibilities, and it's like, well, I've deduced that it must be either these possibilities, I'm not sure which one, therefore it has to go to morality. Like even that kind of logic of getting to that point of deduction, or
that's personal logic, right? That is entirely subjective, but it's subjective. Subjective just means it's my objective truth. Effectively, it's an opinion, right? That is an opinion. Fundamentally, that's an opinion, but it's my opinion for me, which I'm explaining to you because we think it's interesting. I think the point of science, right, is that it isn't trying to find an objective truth. It's trying to find the closest thing to the objective truth by getting a kind of group subjectivity. So you have multiple people who will be doing, these experiments. And of course, each one is going to be getting subtly different results because they're different people. But if you can find the pattern in that result, you can eventually go, what is most likely to be true for all of them?
In theory, I agree with you. But
well, good, because I like that theory.
I don't think it's... I think the fact that people are subjective just sort of negates the effectiveness of science in dealing with that subjectivity, because that
but science is a subjective, like it's trying to work out an agreed subjective truth. It's not trying to work out an objective truth. So the fact that people are subjective, I think, doesn't do any negating.
Yeah, but I think science started out as the material, looking at the material,
trying to work out an objective truth.
But it started out as acknowledging that it didn't have a place at looking at the other stuff apart from material, and it's now expanded to think that it can. And I don't think that, or think it can encompass the whole of reality and be used to deduce and say in that way, and be able to work out what is the...
Okay, so this is where I think the scientific method doesn't go, but where I think the scientific, the body of scientists that have an influence around the world really does go.
Exactly. And that's
yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that science, the academic science, and people like how much do you want to piss people off here? People like Dawkins get it horrendously wrong. He writes a whole book about not having faith and just having rational thought. But then he and kind of, well, if there's no evidence for it, why should I believe it? Well, there's no evidence, if there is a moral consequence, if there are consequences to not believing something that could have consequences, then you kind of have to. Like that, I fully agree that there are very much issues, and there's also there's an entirely valid point, which I think at one point Eisenstein does make actually in the book. He makes a really good analogy where he says there is a unicorn. There is a unicorn in front of me. Right? I'm telling you right now, there is in fact a unicorn sat in between me and the camera. I can see it, but you can't. It's not like it, and I'm not making this up. There is truly a unicorn here for me, right? But it isn't true for you. Science can't answer that, but it doesn't make it any less important for me. It actually, I think it does make it totally unimportant for you because it isn't true for you. Both of these things could exist, right? And modern science totally disregards them. And I do think, and when I say modern science, I mean modern science as an academic body totally disregards them. And then that's used, and that is a problem. When it comes to trying to discern the truth, that's a problem. What I don't think it's a problem in, really, funnily enough, is making group decisions as a society, making decisions in politics, in business, as a group. I don't think it's actually that much of a problem. I think we need to acknowledge that that is the case, and we don't do that nearly enough. We always seem to say, science says this is true, which is a horrendous paraphrasing of it. Science says this is we should say every time, but we don't have time to. We should say, science says this is most likely to be true for us as a group. But what we paraphrase that to is science says this is true. And The thing is, functionally, they're the same when it comes to making group decisions, but when it comes to making individual ones, they're not the same at all. And you can't disregard the fact that the unicorn might actually be stood in front of you.
But I think that the fact that there's a difference between making individual decisions and making group decisions is kind of an illusion of the separation between the individual and the group.
Right, but how integrated are the two? Oh, Zoe is saying something.
Can I just jump in with a question?
Yeah.
For Emma.
Yes.
So the idea of having some sort of individual presence or subjectivity, I get the sense that you feel like that's what's missing from science's idea of the subjective. But how then do you sort of progress forward? Like how is it? I mean, coming together is so important. Coming as a group is an important way for bigger change. Like, how can you just talk more about how you sort of connect the dots between the subjective and pushing forward as a more collective then mindset? What's the next step? Because I feel like that needs some sort of explanation.
Yeah, I think the next step is more of a holistic understanding of science, which Ro doesn't like that, but
really hate that. Sorry.
Because
no, keep talking.
Because I think often science, the way that science thinks that we can understand the world is to, as I said earlier, break things down into their constituent parts and explain how they work through that. And things like, and maybe it doesn't take into account how what's described as emergent phenomena from a whole. That probably doesn't make much sense. Basically,
what I'm trying to ask is, like, more so in your opinion, how do you place value on the individual versus the collective?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In that general sort of question of, yes, like everyone has a differing opinion or bias or however you want to phrase it, but then what is the sort of next what is the collective within that sort of parameter of thinking?
You're basically asking me how to save the world, or how we should be relating to one another, maybe. I mean, this is maybe like a separate stream from kind of science, but I'd say, in my opinion, just being humble is key, actually. Being humble for like where your own beliefs have come from and not forcing them on others. Now, that's a very vague statement.
Do you feel that science forces? I feel like that's sort of part of the issue with what Eisenstein sort of says. Do you feel that science forces its beliefs on others?
Yes.
As a body or as a method?
I think both. I think mainly as a body, but as a method in particularly our culture.
As in, you think the scientific method does it? Because I agree with you, and I think it's quite important that it does do that.
It's important that it does force.
Yeah.
So I would say that in our because it has been used for so much success in our culture to do many things. I'm not sure
that's also. I'm not sure that is the reason why.
No, I think it is because it's given through being successful. It's given power, or it gives power because it's a way that humans can kind of manipulate force on the world. And
But that's not the main. That's not the reason why I think it is effective. I think he's identified that, and that's nice and believable. But I actually don't think that's the root reason why it's effective. I think the root reason why it's effective is that you can take multiple people with multiple belief systems, and the belief systems, provided they believe there is something, and they aren't Buddhist, and they don't believe that everything is totally perception, and they do believe that the other individuals they're talking to exist, then they believe in the assumptions of science, and by extension kind of have to, or many of them feel are persuaded by science to say that this is an objective truth, this is something we can agree on, and therefore we can build from that as a society. You're never going to get Muslims and Christians to agree precisely on how a society should be run, but you can get the majority of them to agree on at least the scientific evidence based on the assumptions, but not necessarily. I mean, technology is a useful example of persuading them for that, but I'm not sure that's the core reason they believe it. I think part of the reason they believe it is because it's a believable system anyone from any kind of belief background can subscribe to. So it's quite a good place to build from. And I think that's inherent from its origin as a place to build, trying to produce a place to build from for people from different backgrounds trying to make kind of group decisions.
Yeah, I'm not sure I disagree with much of what you said. I think the key point is that it's maybe a place to build from, but maybe not so much that, but more of a one way. I think it's got too much power. It's got too much kind of sway.
Or it gives power to the people who supposedly, well, I mean, often they do, but it gives power to the scientific community, which at the end of the day is a rather small group of human beings.
But science through technology gives power to a hell of a lot more people over other people, over nature, over. But I think it's more than that. I think it's the fact that, okay, science as you described it in your assumptions, you were like, it seems that there is something that's materialist, but it doesn't rule out the existence of other things.
Yeah.
However, that's not how it's portrayed. I think people have to, if people who are believing in whatever religion, kind of, they have to accept it because obviously there is some sort of a shared truth there. However, if they really look into it, depending on what scientific view or what scientific philosophy you go into, it negates the existence of their religion. If they really go into it,
or at least large parts of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Provided you're not often Buddhists have not had that issue, for example, because they simply have less base assumptions than scientists do, which is often why they kind of coexist harmoniously. So I don't think it always happens, but yes, no, I agree with often Christians, you see it happening all the time in the Western world. I think I can say Western because we're talking about largely the enlightened Christian world, but also, plenty of other religions. You definitely do see conflict, and science does try to. There's a social pressure, I think, for science to override, largely because the rest of the social kind of apparatus is not necessarily Christian. Mm-hmm. It doesn't hold the rest of those belief systems. So you kind of have all of society versus subsection of society when it comes to, and all of society is saying, well, we agree with science, and the subsect is going, we're Christian. Okay. I have a question for you, Emma.
Okay.
This is one that's puzzled me for a while. I'm going to try and, I had it a second ago, I'm going to try and phrase it well. So, as I understand, you think that, or and as Eisenstein explains in his book, we're separated, right? At the moment, we're not separated, but we think we are. Yeah, am I understanding that correctly? Because I want to make sure I'm phrasing this properly. So,
yeah, I think so.
We have this myth of separation where we've kind of we've identified ourselves as something other than we are, which is totally separate individuals. Right? Now, I can agree with him to a certain extent because we don't really understand emotions or the way the brain works, that perhaps there could be very real emotional connections, if you will, and we could be connected and there could be more into being spiritually or however other way, materially perhaps. There could be a kind of emotional connection between multiple individuals.
Mm-hmm.
But what I sort of intrinsically feel like I know, right, is that the thoughts I'm thinking now are not the same thoughts you're thinking now. Right? You are not thinking the exact same thing that I'm thinking, and you're not. And if I wasn't speaking, you wouldn't be able to think what I'm thinking. There's not a shared thought there. So to some extent, there is some. It might not be as separated as we have defined ourselves, but I think there is some cognitive separation, some conscious separation between people, between individuals.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth acknowledging. And if you want to believe in, and so if you've got this cognitive separation, how then do you have to accept that we need to make group decisions, right? And also, if you don't have that, and if we are a kind of total interbeing, then how can you have subjective truth at all? Surely if we're all one, then there is only one objective truth for all of us.
I think this was what I was trying to ask earlier. I think you put it more
what you said triggered my thought process there, Zoe. So it's inspired that.
Okay, so you're saying
it's kind of, two-pronged question. Sorry about that.
There is some degree of separation, which I agree with, because I am not thinking exactly what you're thinking. Therefore, we do have to make some kind of group decision. Kind of, one, how do we do that? And secondly, if there's some degree of separation, how are we all one?
Yeah, and if we're all one, if we are all one, I mean, truly, like, how can you have subjectivity? Because you've all got the same truth. If we're all truly interconnected, then we all have the same objective truth. Would be my understanding of that.
Yeah, so we're getting into like realms of truth, which is something that I'd love to do like a whole nother podcast on and do a hell of a lot more reading on, because I'm not so sure myself. So I'm mainly working on kind of intuitions here. But I do feel like there is an objective truth
that is valid for all of us.
Yes. However, I feel like that objective truth is, and this is just where I am at the minute with my thinking, and it might change probably.
Thinking is a good word. You should explain that to your boyfriend.
Yeah, so I feel like there is some kind of universal truth, but this truth is so vast and complex and multifaceted, and almost as big as the universe itself, that we, as I almost think of it as like separate nodes of kind of consciousness of the universe.
That's bigger than the universe itself, right? Because it could be more than just that.
Okay, as big, bigger, yeah. But so I feel the way I think about it is like the universe is this like kind of organic, evolving points of different consciousness, or through kind of self-organizing entities and systems that evolve different levels of consciousness, and this consciousness are all like reflections of aspects of this like eternal truth. That's where I'm at the minute.
What have I walked into here? Oh my goodness. Levels of consciousness. Wow.
So it's a bit different. So it's almost like the reason why. So I feel like it's not contradictory that we are all one because we are kind of like from the same, and there is this universal truth. However, that's so big that no one as an individual could ever comprehend that. That's what
surely if we couldn't comprehend that, we'd need to pool our subjective understandings of it in some sort of,
like
cohesive way. Oh wow, you jumped to conclusions there.
Science disregards a lot of subjectivity, a lot of it, I think. But then,
subjectivity which cannot be mutually understood, right?
Sorry.
It only regards the subjectivity which can be corroborated by other subjects. So it only regards that truth which is true for all of us.
If there's any objective truths, then that's fine, right?
So the method in itself doesn't disregard the fact that that other subjectivity might be true for the individual. It's just that the community and the body it does. And I think the vast majority of even scientists like me probably do. But I mean, the method itself doesn't.
Yeah, I think I don't quite know how to explain it in words, but I don't think it's the kind of truth that means that if you discover it, you'll suddenly have your life planned out and there'll be a one singular way that everyone should live and work together and live. Like,
neither do I.
The universe is a self-organizing and evolving system.
Well, but I mean, so I think what science can feasibly do if this exists, which we don't know if it does exist, is perhaps discover the why, like the causes for the universe, right? For the material world, science could, in theory, discover why the material world, could answer that question. All of the why the material world, blah. But it can never answer the effects, right? It can use the why to perhaps predict them, but only those effects which are causal. So it'll never, even if it does, provide us with a lot of answers to a lot of big questions, it'll never provide us with all the answers that will give us, and it'll never provide us with enough data to even use the kind of theories to provide comprehensive enough answers to kind of solve everything and agree on everything and live a perfect life. But it can get us closer, a bit like its understanding of the truth, right? Is that it can never actually get there, but it can get us closer. I doubt science will ever get us 99.9999999% of the way to living a perfect life. They'll be far off that, even at its best. But it can certainly, inherently not certainly, but I think it can probably get us closer. I think it has got us closer.
I think it played a part, definitely. I think science needs to
back off
and open up. Or the scientific body then needs to evolve and open up.
Yeah, but I think that's something that happens almost with time, happens with people and scientists and people in the scientific body, listening to podcasts on it needing to open up, and good ones, obviously not this one, reading articles on it and kind of generally arguing and debating and trying to do that in a reasoned way. I think almost that's not like the method is what endures. It's not necessarily the culture of the community at any given point. So if you are saying there's an issue with the culture of the scientific body, scientific academia, then fine, that's something we can tackle. But I'm not sure it's necessarily like, it's not like, in my mind, attacking the core mythology of the world we live in. Like kind of because you'd still have the scientific method and you'd still be doing that, and there still would be like a scientific body, but it just might have hopefully non-totally material views and non-dismissive views.
Method enough, yeah.
You want to start?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, well, I've been absent for a bit of it, but we haven't really attacked.
Still, yeah. We've already had a kind of pre-pod discussion where Sil really tested me on this. So I think
we've been discussing a lot about how potentially the
cultural problems.
Yeah. And,
yeah, and I think we largely agree on those as well.
Yeah, I think
it's just I think perhaps where we differ is how fundamental they are. But yeah, no, Sil, if you have any questions about the method itself, they're the ones that.
Well, I was thinking, could we go back to the quote by Eisenstein on the causality of the determinism that he states in that, where he says, I don't know, you disagreed with it.
I can quote it out again. I can quote it out again if you want.
Because, yeah, you say you strongly disagree with it, and I remember not disagreeing with it.
Yeah, that did shock me that you didn't disagree with it. Because when I showed it, I was like, hold on, am I going mad? This is when I showed it to Mikey. And he was like, no, you're not going mad. It makes no sense. Or rather, Zoe, you also sent a photo. Can you share your screen? Photo of the determinism stuff.
I think you're more equipped to explaining this than I am.
But yeah, it'd be good if we could. Yes.
Wait, what? Where did you get this from?
Mikey.
Is this what?
This isn't from Mikey now. This is from Mikey just, contacting Zoe independently at another date.
As we were arguing about the chapter, and he sent me this as his explanation. Essentially, how I'm not going to be the best one to explain it, but it's kind of like that community episode where you roll a dice, and from that die you can have 6 different outcomes.
But the outcomes are random. So I sent to Rupert at a time when Emma mentioned that she thought science had this kind of one encompassing pathway. And the way Mikey was trying to explain it to me was that it's the universe is non-deterministic but finite. So it kind of
he believes
it can give many pathways. But there is a some number of pathways that it can produce. But I think, Rob, if you understand it, I think you're more apt.
So basically, the way I would try and use this is like there are plenty. Basically, on a fundamental level, there are 2 mechanisms on the right for a rational. Not even necessarily irrational, but like a kind of an understandable way a universe could exist, a system could exist that is non-deterministic, either finite or infinite. And obviously, Mikey believes the universe is finite, and that there is but that it's a non-deterministic system, which I don't really know much about the finite or infinite nature of the universe, but I certainly would agree that I think it's non-deterministic, because I think if you look at, radioactive decay, we know that to be random.
We don't, but
I
think a lot of engineers who I've talked to definitely believe it's only pseudo random, and definitely don't believe it's random.
All the physicists that I know of, that I've ever encountered, believe it's random.
Really? Who?
Lots.
I'm sure a lot of do believe.
The radioactive decay is random.
Yeah.
Well, this is not really the point of discussion, but I know a lot of people.
No, but as in, basically, if it is, then the universe can't be. The same initial conditions will not result in the same final conditions, because you have the same block of with all the same spin and particles, etc., of radioactive material, and you measure the first period of radioactive decay, and you'll get different times.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting that Mike believes it's non-deterministic, because I thought his whole thing was that it could be modeled by a computer program.
But you can have non-deterministic computer programs, right? You can have a model.
Well, we can't because we don't have the capability yet, but it could be done potentially, yeah.
Yeah. The starting conditions constantly changing randomly, i.e., radioactive decay happening randomly, continually, all the time.
Sure, but I was more talking about So what was Eisenstein's quote then?
So I can read it all out again. So here is a central assumption of the scientific method that may seem so obvious as to be beyond dispute. If two people perform an identical experiment, they will get the same results. Fine with that. This requires, 1, determinism, that the same initial conditions will result in the same final conditions.
Well, stop there.
Same final conditions. My opinion, bollocks.
The same.
And 2, objectivity.
Yeah,
the experiment.
We'll get there when we get there. So the same starting conditions
will result in the same, but the same initial conditions will result in the same final conditions. And I think my issue is that I don't think science assumes that, rather than.
But
I also don't think
surely
that's
that
true,
is causality, as in like that is.
No, that's determinism. Causality believes that a totally causal system is determinism. Okay. But science only assumes partial causality. It assumes there are some reasons for some of the things that happen, not that everything that happens has a total reason.
I didn't think. Yeah, he uses the word determinism here, and I'm not sure he actually means determinism. I more understood it as partial causality.
Partial. Total causality.
No. As in, determinism might mean total causality, but I don't think that's what he actually meant.
Yes, it is.
I'm not sure it is. I think.
Well, he's stated determinism and then the correct definition for determinism, which is that the same initial conditions will result in the same final conditions. For a given, that would be determinism, and I don't think science assumes that. At least, I don't think the method assumes that. I think plenty of scientists do assume that.
I think.
Well, yeah,
that's a problem.
I mean, no, yeah, we've already.
Yes, no, I agree. That's a problem.
We're trying to punch holes in the actual method here.
But is that?
Sorry.
That is the way in which science is carried out.
Yeah. Not by all scientists. In fact, no, it's not. It's not. It's not the way. It's the way science is incorrectly, I think, interpreted by the modern scientific community. I don't think it's the way the methodology of the experiments is still carried
out. For example, right?
That's why everyone repeats their experiments.
No, people repeat their experiments because the conditions might be slightly different.
That's one reason as well. But people also repeat them for this reason.
Initial conditions, they will result in the exact same final conditions.
Yeah.
Like, as in he's saying.
No, but part of the reason they think the conditions might be different isn't just like human error or machine error or, part of the difference is because, you cannot control all the initial conditions, because even if you could, they would quickly not become the same initial conditions, because the same initial conditions don't, in general physics, don't result in the same final conditions.
Oh, I'm really not sure about that. I think that science does assume that, because because as in, I think what you're saying, is what he meant as well. The exact same initial conditions will result in the exact same final conditions or final outcomes. And I think, Rob, you were saying that's not just because of we then repeat experiments. You say we repeat experiments because science believes that there could be different outcomes from initial. I don't think that is true, because, for example, if you look at a Feynman diagram or something, it suggests if you have two particles incoming, there's only a certain number of outcomes. And it's almost limited.
Yeah, but it isn't. That's the point. Is there are multiple outcomes. It's not guaranteed. That's the whole point of finite non-determinism. There are a set number of outcomes, but they aren't always going to give the same outcome. It's not one outcome. It's not guaranteed. So I don't understand. I've not seen a Feynman diagram. I probably have. I just don't know exactly what you mean. But by the sounds of things, that would be finite non-determinism rather than finite determinism.
No, actually, no.
Determinism.
There is only one possible. There is only one. It does state there's only one possible outcome. I'm struggling to think of something where there could be more than one possible outcome. Could you
other than radioactive decay, or do you think radioactive?
No. As in, we've already established radioactive decay is potentially something some scientists believe is random, but I think that's.
I'm going to give this a quick Google.
I'm not sure there's anything else. Can you think of an example that does have multiple outcomes in science?
The double slit experiment.
What do you mean?
Where they shoot a single photon.
Yeah.
At slit.
Yeah.
And what happens then?
It diffracts.
It splits.
It doesn't split.
Oh yeah, so it
the splitting of something.
It acts as a wave.
It acts as though there are multiple.
Yeah, quantum theory not predicated on the fact that nature is, at its deepest level, nature is random and unpredictable? New scientist.
Yeah. So I think Eisenstein here, when he's talking about the scientific method, I think he's talking about both before things like quantum theory and etc. came about, and also what is the general what do you call it? The scientific body.
And also, supposedly, the radioactive decay is supposedly truly random. It's a subatomic.
As in, what was I going to say?
Get a physicist on to tell us how we're wrong about that. But
even quantum mechanics, right? I still think potentially it says things are random at its deepest level. However, I think that's because we can't understand its deepest level potential. I'm questioning myself now.
But the point is, the method assumes assumes that it's not totally causal. It's not a matter whether we've discovered that or not. That's what the science even allowed us to question that, which means inherently it can't assume that. It's just that on a macro level, we had found that everything happened to be deterministic. That's the way I understood it to have come out anyway.
I mean, I think you can still assume, for example, 1 + 1 = 2. However, using that logic, you can still.
That's different though, right? Because that's not a material. That's a totally subject. That's not subjective, but that cognitive kind of assumption. That's an ideal in an idealistic world. That's not a.
But why is observing an experiment and drawing conclusions from that not ideal in similar ways in terms of logic?
Well, no, it isn't. If it was, then it would be absolutely true, wouldn't it? That'd be a problem. Well, it wouldn't be a problem. It would, but yeah, well, it would just be a different set of problems. Sorry.
Hang on, I don't understand what you just said.
Well, it was sort of a tangent. But I don't really understand what you were questioning. Like, you have 1 + 1 = 2, which is basically just set on a bunch of mathematical agreed upon assumptions in a purely theoretical realm.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not directly, we use the ideas from that and apply them to the real world. But like maths, pure maths, is actually just like conceptual entirely. It's not something that is.
But how do we know this world isn't conceptual? Like, what's the difference?
We don't still that, but isn't, if the world is totally conceptual, then like I don't know that you're real, and therefore there's no point in me trying to make group decisions with you.
Right. So is there
which is why that
assumption in causality?
Say that again.
One assumption in causality that this world is not conceptual and that there is existence.
No, I think that one comes first.
Yeah.
First, yeah. So I think existence comes first.
Yeah.
Before perception or conception or whatever, because you have to assume there's something to perceive or conceive or. Yeah. Then you have whether you're perceiving or conceiving it. Then you have, if you aren't, and it is the outside world beyond the thing you're perceiving, if that does exist, as well as yourself, then you assume whether that's causal or not.
Yeah.
I think it's science. Science, it does it in that order. There's also elements of whether, your thoughts and your perceptions are causal or not. And those are separate questions that Buddhism, I think, has to answer because, well, not just Buddhism, but, ideologies that don't assume kind of material existence have to answer. But science only tries to answer causality in the material sense.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm.
I think one of the main things I got from Eisenstein, and actually just the little discussion you guys had there, is that we're using, I think, our own tools and ways of reasoning that to discern whether science is true or not, or whether determinism is true or not. And
because that's all we can use.
That's all we can use, yes. And
so that's all we should be worried about using.
Like, you can obviously apply, okay, maybe you can apply this argument to like anything, because that's all we can do. But and at the same time, I'm not saying that this means it should like unvalidate everything, but I do think it means that, to me, it shows how science is almost, I don't know, but it is a mythology, I think. And I don't.
Yeah, but it's the most sensible one.
I don't know. I don't.
And the reason, because yes, you can. Fine. It doesn't use things we can't use that we might need to use to fully understand the world, but we can't use them. So why bother worrying about them? Acknowledge they're there, acknowledge it's incomplete, and move on. But that's all you can do, in my mind. You can let some realm of philosophers sort of think about it and suppose about it and maybe come up with some moral conclusions if you want, but I think they've been doing that for a while, and we've landed with the ones who we've currently got sort of stuck with them for the past few hundred years for for a reason, and when I think about them, I can't, with my cognitive capabilities, come up with good reasons to disagree with them.
But I think there are new philosophers and new ideas and things coming all the time.
Yeah, but none of them have fully convinced me to disagree with old sciencey boy yet.
Yeah. What do you think, Zoe?
Be more specific. What's your question?
What did you think of when after you'd read Eisenstein and Mikey had ranted at you and Rob had ranted at you?
I didn't really answer that much.
Good question.
Like, was your mind like swayed from one to the other? Did you have like a gut feeling?
No. I don't think I was swayed in either direction. I think, as a general point, I agree with the sort of base argument that he's giving off, that, I don't know, people need to be more like introspective, and then sort of space to kind of use that more in the wider world. But in terms of disagreeing with science, I saw it as a very interesting lens to look at the world, but not enough that I could say that is the whole truth.
Yeah.
I saw it as a kind of framing of an argument. I wasn't swayed, and that might be because I'm not from like a scientific background to have the knowledge to then agree or disagree, or from the other more philosophical background to kind of sway in the other direction, or be swayed back. So as a kind of completely neutral viewpoint, I didn't disagree with most, like the general book as a whole. But I guess that chapter's hard for me because I don't have the background to disagree with it. So it was kind of, I don't know, very neutral standpoint.
I will say I do think he's right in that on the introspective thing. I really agree with you on that. The world does need people to be more, like, to actually think about themselves, what they think, first principles more. There are so many people, really, people from all stripes of life who have or haven't thought about these things. Like we have some very good friends who definitely haven't thought enough, in my opinion, about said big questions, haven't been introspective enough, and kind of roll with what's given to them. And I think, the way our society is set up, and the way anyone could go about the way our society is set up, like as a democracy, or as democratic societies, where it depends upon multiple people having kind of opinions, and those opinions being as informed as possible to make effective group decisions. The more you've thought about these things, the more effective society is going to be as a whole. And secondly, how on earth anyone can go through life without knowing what they think about life really baffles me.
It's a hard question.
Ignorance is bliss, mate. Ignorance is bliss, mate.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is, though. It really irritates me when I'm ignorant about something. You have to have ignorance about your ignorance for it to be blissful.
Yeah.
No, I think willful ignorance is a thing that...
potentially, yeah.
No, not willful, unconscious ignorance. No.
I think even willful ignorance is...
Conscious ignorance.
I don't think...
No, yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
You're right, but
easy
also,
to go through the motions. Yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah, I think
I do think that's a real point he does make that I will agree with, that the world needs more people to actually think about these things, or needs ordinary people to think about these things.
Mm. Even just a bit, I don't know, more regularly. Like not just once, just sort of check up.
Yeah.
But in saying that,
I think
No, really good point.
yeah, I don't know, in saying that, ignorance in between is, I also think, a fine way to approach living.
yeah, I don't think you can ever blame anyone for anything.
I do. No, I don't know if I blame them. I just get irritated by them.
Yeah, you can get irritated. But yeah, I think it's all a part of our evolution, I guess.
Wow.
Mm.
That got suddenly very. I don't know. I was about to say deterministic. I want to be very. Wouldn't be very cash money of me. Yeah, very deep.
Mm.
So I
Are
don't
we-
like all this reading that you're doing. You're really concerning me that you're just going to come up with some nasty question.
Well, what do you think about that the experimenter can be separated out from the experiment? Assumption of science.
Oh yeah, I don't think that's.
And
I don't think that's an assumption at all. I think you. The point is, you take. This is why, like, most recently discovered stuff that's only been tested by the number of people in that lab is less reliable than all the. We are less. There is more doubt there. I mean, it's still the idea anyway is that it's still beyond reasonable doubt.
Isn't that what he's saying though? That he's saying that it.
But I mean, if you look at the big,
only one person has observed that.
Well, no. You tend to have like a whole lab's worth of people who have observed that.
Sure, but it even invalidates.
It
questions that because supposedly only 5 people have seen this happen, and it's like
So you're taking an average of the subjective. The whole point is we're getting no subjective outcome.
Yeah, but so
you're not trying to separate them out. You're not trying to separate them out. You're trying to say we like accept that the experimenter has given this subjective answer and this experimenter has given this subjective answer, and now as a group we are all looking at. That's why it's open to peer review. You're looking at all these different outcomes and agreeing that the pattern that applies for all of us is this.
Yeah, but I think even
you separate. I guess you could arbitrarily say that you're separating them out by making sure that we get a big average across the whole group.
Well, exactly. Like even just saying that, like we're trying to find something for the collective.
Yeah, so it's fine. You're separating. You're not separating it out per se. You're just making sure that it's relevant to all the individuals who observed it. So it's relevant to all of us.
I actually think you potentially are, because I think, as you say, it cannot validate something that can only be corroborated by one person. That's just a central thing about science. It has to be validated by other people. And why is that? That's what he's meaning by this. Surely you think that's true, as in that science does that.
Science does account for the fact that you can't separate out the experimenter for the experiment. Yeah, I think the science accounts for that extremely well.
But the fact that science says that, like, if one person has observed this in the experiment, it's almost not. It's not valid. As in, doesn't. That's not how.
It's not valid for the group of us, which is what science is trying to work out the truth for, right? It's not trying to work out individual truths.
Yes. So it is as in, like, it assumes. So are you saying basically it's saying it's not saying that's not a truth, but it's like it's saying that that's not
scientific truth, or scientific group truth. Yeah, it's not saying that if I observe, that when I trying to think of an experiment that we did that's, you know, nice and PG.
No, but I think, it probably comes back to this thing where, like, you say this is the perfect scientific method, where I think science would not disregard that as potentially not true for that person, but obviously I think,
yeah, colloquially, everyone would go, and everyone would turn around and go, yeah, you saw that, and that's not true because no one else has seen that.
yeah.
Yeah, but the methodology doesn't say that. That's just what many scientists believe. Or not believe, but think. Maybe believe, yeah. Maybe lots of them do believe that. And I probably do too. I probably do believe that, you know, if we're doing a stickleback experiment and you're, you know, showing a bunch of little fish, big scary fish, and trying to measure their responses and whether they swim towards it, whether they show up their spines, whether they swim away. And, you know, most people say they swim away and some say they swim towards, and most people say their spines go up and some of them, their spines don't go up. And then the last person say, well, they turned into my magical unicorn that only I can see. I'm probably going to say I don't think the unicorn thing's true. But I can't know that. But yes, most scientists these days would probably say the unicorn thing's bollocks, he's lying to you, even though the scientific method wouldn't say the unicorn thing's bollocks. It would just say that that's only true for him.
Yeah, well, I think that's our main
gripe.
Yeah, gripe. That's a good word.
Yeah. Yeah, I would excuse that gripe myself by saying, you know, it's necessary. It's not accurate, but it is necessary to disregard all these individual truths when trying to convince groups of people to make group decisions. If you're trying to get an individual to make an individual decision, then that's up to them. And hopefully they've been more introspective, thought about the world. But if you're trying to convince me of something, you having seen the unicorn literally means nothing to me, because I simply isn't true for me. So how are you going to convince me of that? And why is that relevant?
I think the question of convincing people of something, I don't think people change their minds based on what you'd like to think, as in if science comes up with a truth that is kind of an example of this shared reality. Like, I think if someone comes and says these scientists have found out these facts about this thing, change your mind. Well, they wouldn't say like that, but you're only going to change your mind if those facts fit into your existing worldview, if they fit in your existing beliefs.
Maybe for you, but if it was properly, rigorously done science and it disagreed with what I thought previously to be true, or even believed, and it turned out that previous science was wrong, I would change my mind.
Yeah, so, but even in that, you're like, if it was properly, rigorously done science, you're like, only if it fits into my worldview that science brings the truth, and that if it's rigorously done science and that will be the truth, then I will believe it and believe it to be true.
Yeah.
If someone who maybe has a radically different kind of worldview, like say someone who's really, really strongly Christian, and you're trying to convince them with the facts of science about whatever, and that doesn't fit with their worldview of God and being Christian, they're not going to change their mind because you present them with the facts. People change their mind in different ways. People will change their mind when they change their mind to something that is different from their kind of already held beliefs, only when something shatters those existing beliefs.
And I think, you know, sure, science isn't universally applicable to all human psychology, but neither is anything else. But I will say, I think it's probably the most universally, it might not be the most strongly applicable, but it's the most universally applicable to human psychology. Or at least human group psychology. Perhaps Buddhism is more universally applicable to all humans. But
I also have this objective truth that you say that science doesn't assume objective truth for everyone. I have slight qualms with, because
I think science thinks objective truth for everyone. That's unified field theory, right? But unified field theory hasn't been.
But even,
sorry to jump in. Actually, I'll let you.
Even the things like, for example, the constants and the things it uses to explain or try to come up with these methodologies assumes that, as in, if you're talking about any physical constants that is trying to make sense of the solar system, of planetary movements, it assumes like that surely is inherently assuming that is the same for all of us.
Yeah, that's part of our shared reality.
Yeah, but it is saying that there is this shared reality with this objective truth for all of us, right?
Yeah, because if we didn't have that, then I don't believe that you exist, right? If I don't assume that there's a shared reality, I don't assume you're relevant. You're not relevant to me.
Well, yeah, potentially, but as in, so that is, I don't know, that is still a reasonably big assumption, I'd say.
Yeah, but that's one of the moral assumptions, if you will. Because if I don't assume that, then why should I listen to what anyone says? Because I don't believe that I share a reality with them, and I don't believe that they have any meaning, existence, or relevance.
Do you not think they could have their own completely individual?
Yeah, that's relevant to them. But if it's not associated or shared with mine, then it's not relevant to me at all, is it?
Right. Okay, and you're saying, yeah, but as in, it's still an assumption of, I don't know, I still think...
It is an assumption, but I think it's a necessary one for us to have meaning with regards to each other.
I think, from what I understand, Sil isn't sure of this objective truth existing, because everyone has subjective experience.
But I mean, if you didn't have,
and yeah, I get your counterpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I think there probably is objective truth.
I don't even know if I think there is, but I feel like I have to believe there is, because if there isn't, then there's nothing.
So on that bombshell, we're going to end this part of the science series. Tune in to the next episode titled Overthinking Thinking, where we're joined by two guests, Max and Mikey, who will bring other perspectives from the subjects of history and philosophy of science, psychology, and computer science into the mix. Thanks for listening.